Hello, I'm Jordan. So, over the last week or so, since I put up my last video, I have seen just a skyrocketing increase in subscribers, at least by my standards. I think I've gotten well over 100 just in the last week alone, which is pretty incredible and surprising. I'm not sure exactly what is responsible for that. I think it may have something to do with my video on my favorite books that I read in 2021. That seems to have gotten an inordinate number of views. But whatever the reason, welcome to all of you and thank you for subscribing. I don't expect all of you to stay, and I certainly wouldn't blame you for moving on. But I was thinking about what I can do to kind of commemorate this. I feel like 300 subscribers, which I'm currently over that right now. I'm sure it'll go down a little bit, but that's kind of a milestone, at least in my book. So I was thinking about perhaps doing a Q&A, but it just seems like I don't know. I don't lead a very interesting life, and I never really have. So I don't feel like I would have much to offer there. I certainly wouldn't have the insight or the wonderful rambling stories that like Steve Donahue has on his infamous Q&As. Sorry, Pete wanted to say hi. Um, and then I thought about doing a library tour because those are kind of running around right now. But then after watching Steve's and especially Jason Harrigan's, I just started to feel deeply inadequate as a reader. So I don't think a library tour is appropriate either, especially since I've only read probably 50% of the books in my library. And I don't have as extensive a library as Jason or Steve, obviously. So I thought I would just kind of do a video on myself as a reader, because of course this is all about me talking about myself. And one thing that has been on my mind lately, because I've been doing a read along of Ka by John Crowley with Tom L.A. Books. Crowley is one of my all-time favorite writers. He is certainly my favorite living writer. I went back and read an essay of his. It's actually a lecture of his called Unrealism, talking about realism in relation to what he calls romance. And it got me thinking about what kind of reader I am, what kind of fiction I like, what I expect from fiction, what I expect from reading. And I thought I'd kind of discuss that here and open it up to discussion for anyone who wants to comment. Um, I didn't really work out exactly what I'm going to say here. I'm just going to kind of run with it. But essentially, the premise of Crowley's lecture is that there are two strands of story, and I think he claims that he takes a lot of these ideas from Northrop Frye, who I have not read much of. But his central idea in this lecture is that there are basically two kinds of stories. There's what's considered realism, and then there's what's considered romance. And I don't, of course, mean romance in the sense of romantic love, although, of course, it can involve that. Romance here is used to describe, the folk tradition or elements of the fantastic or just storytelling for storytelling's own sake. And I have always, or not always, but certainly in recent years, I have considered myself very much a proponent of romance over realism. Realism does not do a whole lot for me in fiction. Certainly, I find it very admirable and beautiful and striking when it's done well. I think I love Henry James, for example, and I think that you would have to consider him a realist, despite his many ghost stories. I also think Virginia Woolf is perhaps the greatest writer of English prose that I know of. And she was, I think, very committed to realism to a certain extent. Of course, there's the book Orlando, which is not realist at all. But I do think certainly To the Lighthouse and Mrs. Dalloway, which are the two I'm most familiar with, are very firmly entrenched in the realist tradition, even if they are kind of modernist. I think modernism has a lot to do with realism. I think they're intertwined. But I'm not a literary scholar. That's just kind of my own thoughts on the matter. Anyways, my point is that I prefer romance. I prefer the fantastic, which is not necessarily fantasy novels, which I think can be pretty flat and predictable, but the fantastical I really, really enjoy. I think a modernist who subscribes to that so beautifully and strikingly is, of course, Borges. Where is Borges? I can't right? How do I do this? That should not be so difficult. That's Borges right up there, who played with the idea of storytelling for its own sake and the nature of fiction in relation to the real world, I think, in a very engaging and striking way as a modernist. Where am I going with this? I was saying that I prefer romance, but the point that Crowley makes in his essay, which I started with, called Unrealism, is that even books that consider themselves part of the realist tradition or who are devoted to realism are using elements of romance because that is the primary tool with which we as people tell stories. I'm going to read a quote. It's a little dense, but I think it'll give you an idea of what Crowley is getting at here. He says, over time, most, if not all, of the devices of romance have found their way, sometimes in disguise, into that brand new kind of storytelling called realism or naturalism, which appears after centuries of romances and is explicit in rejecting most of the features of the old moldy tales. When stories of non-romance kinds, including realistic fictions of everyday life, adopt or turn on the devices of romance, and almost all to some extent do, then Fry uses the term displacement to describe the effect, the adjusting of the formulaic and stereotyped structures of folk tales and romances to a roughly credible context. So the difference between these romance tropes and effects as they appear displaced, the difference between these romance tropes and effects as they appear displaced into the non-magical ordinary world in realistic novels, and as they appear bare, so to speak, in fantasy novels, is largely a difference in recognizability. We recognize them immediately in romances, indeed greet them as old friends. In realistic novels, we are supposed to not notice their presence. I think that might be wishful thinking on my part as a devotee of romance, but I think there is certainly something to that even realistic novels hinge on certain tropes of romance. And he goes into some of those tropes there. I think most of you will know. Basically, think fairy tale tropes or mythological tropes. So the wandering hero or the disguised princess or a homecoming or an exodus. All of these things, I think, are present in any kind of... Ernie wants to get up on my shoulder. In any kind of story that human beings tell that's worth anything at all. And I think sometimes it's explicitly used in realist books, like he brings up Ulysses by James Joyce, which I am not a fan of, but certainly that is using mythological and romantic tropes in a very conscious way in a realistic setting. And then other times it's not done consciously at all. It's just the way we naturally tell stories. So to me, a realist novel that denies that fact or that is not interested in the fact that it's telling these stories that have been told a million times is doing a disservice to the reader and doing a disservice to what fiction can do. And it's being dishonest about what fiction does, which is not to say that realism is somehow subordinate to romance, although I do think it's secondary because it did come later, I think. But I do think anyone who wants to write off anything if it doesn't have verisimilitude or if it doesn't feel realistic, I think they're missing the point. The very act of reading fiction is a fantasy, which is not to denigrate fiction as a general pursuit either. I just think we need to keep in mind what fiction is and the tropes that we're using to execute it. I'm not sure if I'm making any sense at all there. I think the bottom line is I would just argue that not only is fantasy and romance more interesting to read for me, I would also say it is also deeply ingrained in the identity of the act of storytelling in a way that realism is not. So anyways, let me know what you guys think of that, and let me know if you prefer realism or if you prefer romance. What do you look for in your fiction? Does it bug you if there's fantastical elements? Does it bug you if it's too hell-bent on realism? I'd be very curious to know your thoughts on that. And once again, thank you to all of you who are newcomers, and thank you to all of you who have been watching me for a while. And have a good day.